Okay, it is time for me to cover a verb form that to this day still trips me up. Passive voice. Most learners of Japanese know that passive voice is the bane of their existence. Not only is it a little confusing that Japanese uses passive voice so much compared to English, but the other thing to make it extra confusing is the conversion to passive voice. Some of the verbs, the conversions sound quite similar to the potential form, the I can do this verb form. So sometimes it's confusing. Is it passive or is it potential? I don't know. But anyway, if you're confused after this lesson or during this lesson, or if you've already tried to cover passive voice and you're confused, don't feel bad about it. It's very confusing. It's still one of the hardest things, I think, for most people about learning Japanese. So just embrace the difficulty, embrace the pain, and let's just try to get through it. So here are some sentence pairs in English. I'm going to start with like a non-passive sentence, and then I'm going to translate it into the passive version of itself. And remember, the passive version basically takes away the person or the entity who did the action. So, police shot the black man versus the black man was shot. We don't know by whom. I ate the strawberries. Versus the strawberries were eaten. Oh gee, Mom, I don't know who ate those strawberries. They were sure eaten. Mary gave Steve a present versus Steve was given a present. Steve still got his present, but in the second sentence, in the passive sentence, we don't know that it was Mary. Maybe we don't like Mary and we just want to kind of erase her from the picture. Say, well, Steve got a present. Doesn't matter who it was from. Who cares? Superman is saving the planet versus the planet is being saved. But we're not going to give credit to Superman for it. So now let's go back and learn how we actually convert verbs into passive voice. This is the fun part. All right, so for do verbs, you drop the final do and you add rareru. So they become tongue twisters as well. So taberu becomes taberareru. So to eat becomes is eaten. Miru becomes mirareru, so to see becomes is seen. Kangaeru, to think, becomes kangaerareru, so to think becomes is thought. Now, does that look familiar to you? It should, because this is the exact same rule for changing do verbs into their potential form. Just pointing that out to reassure you that you're not crazy. Yep, it's the same rule, which is yet another reason why it's difficult to remember passive voice because it sounds similar to potential. So to convert an u verb, it's easier to show the concept in romaji because it deals more with like u sound rather than the u character. So you drop the final letter u, not hiragana u, but the letter u, and you add areru. So utau becomes utawareru, to be sung at. Iku becomes ikareru. Ooh, is that matsu or motsu? Matsu becomes matareru. Hanasu becomes hanasareru. Toru becomes torareru. Yomu becomes yomareru. And yaru becomes yarareru. Now for irregular verbs, it's always, you just have to memorize them. So suru becomes sareru. And kuru becomes korareru. So just as with many other verb conversions and conjugations, once you've converted verbs into a passive voice, note that they now all end in do. They are also now all do verbs. So you conjugate them as do verbs, regardless of what kind of verb they were before the conversion. Like utau used to be an u verb. But once you change it to utawareru, it is now a do verb, right? And you conjugate it as such. So for an example, yomu becomes yomareru, becomes yomareta, becomes yomarenai, becomes yomaretai, or yomarete, etc. If you want to memorize these passive verbs, a lot of people I've heard when they memorize, like they use flashcards or whatever to learn and memorize verbs and stuff, rather than like remembering how you convert them and then applying that conversion every time you want to use a verb in its potential form or its volitional form or its passive voice or whatever, a lot of people say that it's better to just memorize those versions of those verbs just on their own. So rather than thinking in your mind every time, okay, drop the do, carry the to, add 3, you can just be like, oh, yomareru, that means to be read. And that's kind of how I learned it as well. I don't go through these conversions in my head, and that's why I kind of get tripped up if I have to do passive voice version of verbs that I usually don't do passive voice version of, because then I have to do the conversions in my head. And it's like, it's a lot easier, I think, if you just memorize what these verbs are in these various other forms. So keep that in mind also. But once you have converted your verbs to passive voice, here's how you can construct some sentences with them. So this is how normal Japanese sentences are structured. Subject, wa or ga, object, wo, verb. And that means the subject, verbs, the object. That's like our very basic Japanese sentence structure that we learned towards the beginning. So this is how passive sentences are typically structured. Object, wa or ga, subject, ni, passive verb. So the main change here is we're using particle ni. So that means the object is verbed by the subject. So you may remember that particle ni, among meaning many different other things, it can mean by or by means of, and that should help you wrap your head around why particle ni is used in here. It is, the ball is kicked by me, or by the teacher. Sensei ni kerareta. The ball is kicked by the teacher, ni. So that's why we use particle ni. And also note that while this is like the full sentence of passive, you don't have to include every single word in the sentence. Like you can construct a complete sentence with just a passive verb and that's it. You can just do subject ni passive verb without an object, or you can say object and then the passive verb. You don't need the subject. So keep that in mind also. You don't always need to make your sentences like have a object, a subject, and a passive verb for it to be a complete sentence with a passive verb, just like normal Japanese sentences. So here are some passive sentences. 息子はよく学校で笑われます. So notice that I'm using the masu form of this warawareru. Warawareru. It sounds funny, just like the word. It means to laugh or to be laughed at. So I drop the ru and I change it to masu because it's a ru verb. 息子は, as for my son, よく, often, 学校で, so at school, 笑われます. So notice I'm already kind of changing up the structure of the sentence here. I'm adding a location. I'm not adding a subject. I'm saying my son is often laughed at when he's at school, but I'm not saying who is laughing at my son. And that is one of the utilities of passive sentences. I can take out the subject, like I can take out the blame. Well, somebody laughs at my son at school. Not going to say who it is, but he's laughed at. It doesn't necessarily matter like who is doing the laughing. What matters is my son is being laughed at school a lot and it hurts his feelings and he's depressed because of it. But if I reworded that into English, because in English we often don't use passive voice, I would just go ahead and say my son's classmates laugh at him a lot. Here's another. Misaちゃんはスーパーで誰かにカバンを盗まれました. So again, I'm doing past tense, passive voice, polite this time. So 盗まれました. 盗まれる, it would be the just neutral is stolen. But I changed it to まれました, so was stolen. Misa-chan, Misa, right? Yeah. Misa-chan wa, as for Misa, スーパーで at the supermarket, 誰かに, so this 誰か is the subject, 誰かに by someone, カバンを kaban, the object, bag, 盗まれました. So Misa's bag was stolen from her by someone, 誰かに at the market. And reworded into better English, not passive voice, because again, in English, passive voice sounds kind of weird. Someone stole Misa's bag at the supermarket is kind of how we just say that in English. 私は母に愛されたかった. So here's another conjugation of the verb. Now we are the Thai form, want to verb, but past tense of that. So たかった. 愛されたかった. I wanted to be loved. By whom? 母に, I wanted to be loved by my mother. Or I wish my mother loved me in like cleaner, better, more natural sounding English. 先輩に見られちゃった. This is a very common sentence. You'll see this a lot in shoujo manga. It's a common plot trope. So 見られちゃった. So 見られてしまった. I'm doing yet another verb conjugation of 見られる to be seen. 見られてしまった or 見られちゃった is to be seen completely and or unfortunately. If you remember the te shimau verbs that we covered many, many lessons ago, this was like last year we covered in Genki 1. So I was seen, and it's a bad thing that I was seen. Whom was I seen by? Senpai ni. So by senpai. My senpai. I was seen unfortunately, by senpai. That is a horrible, horrible translation. What that actually means is my senpai walked in on me, or my senpai saw me naked, depending on the context. Usually to be seen, mirarechatta. It usually means like I was seen like in a state of being that I shouldn't have been seen in. Like I was either naked or I was changing or I was like at a cult meeting or something or I was doing magic or I was transforming into a magical girl and somebody saw me and they weren't supposed to see me. Oh no, somebody saw me basically. So depending on context, that could be many different things, but I just translate it as my senpai saw me naked. Like in this case, mirarechatta, he walked in on me when I was getting dressed and I was naked. My senpai saw me naked. 昨日、山田君がヒロキ先輩に告白されたそうよ。All right, yet another verb conjugation. So 告白される。告白する is to either tell someone for the first time that you have a crush on them or to ask them out. It depends on the context. 告白された means was asked out or was told by somebody that they have a crush on me for the first time. But I add the so at the end of that. So you may remember several lessons ago, if you add so to the end of something, it means, I heard that. So 告白されたそうよ. I heard that so-and-so was asked out. 昨日, yesterday, 山田君がHiroki senpai ni. So by Hiroki senpai, Yamada-kun is the one who was being asked out by Hiroki senpai. So yesterday, I hear that Yamada was told I love you for the first time by Hiroki is like the literal passive voice translation of this sentence, but what it really is I hear Hiroki finally told Yamada I love you yesterday. This is just a note to any aspiring translator who's watching this. Like, it's usually a good idea to convert any passive voice sentence into non-passive voice, just because in English we use active voice. We do not really use passive voice that much. Like, we still do use it for sure. And sometimes you have no choice but to keep it passive because maybe like they're leaving out one of the key players of the sentence, like the object or the subject or something. And so you have to word it passively so that you can still leave those things out in English and it flows. But usually it's best to flip that translation and make it no longer passive voice because it just sounds so weird and it's overly wordy and clunky in English, but it does not at all sound weird and clunky in Japanese. It in fact is like very frequently how they talk. Here is a cool mei serifu, a famous like line, a catchphrase from Sailor Moon. 新たな時代に誘われてセーラーウラヌス、華麗に活躍. I have that memorized. I didn't even have to consult my notes. So 新たなis a fancy way of saying 新しい, so a new. 時代 is an era. に, so by a new era. So this 新たな時代 is the subject. に誘われて. So 誘われる, to be invited by. So, but I'm doing the te form of it because I'm continuing that thought. So invited by a new era. セーラーウラヌス. I am Sailor Uranus. 華麗に活躍. 華麗に means like brilliantly. 活躍 is a pretty complicated verb stem. 活躍する. It means like to do something with flying colors, like it'll often be like in action if you're in battle or something, but it doesn't have to be in battle. It can be like in sports or in school. Like 活躍している means like she's shining, she's doing really well, she's like knocking out all the competition, she's like thriving with flying colors. By the way, quick plug for my series, Watch Sailor Stars Learn Japanese. You can see an episode where I break down a lot of Sailor Uranus and Neptune's and Pluto's dialogue and how they speak Japanese and everything, including this very speech. But yeah, in this case, I actually kept the translation in passive voice, invited by a new era, because I wanted to preserve like the word order. Otherwise, you'd say like a new era invited Sailor Uranus, and that sounds kind of weird. It sounds sort of like a new era invited Sailor Uranus to a party or something. I don't know. But this is actually poetic, this line of speech. So in that case, the passive voice actually works pretty well for it. So you don't always have to convert passive to active. Here's a sentence you might see in song lyrics. 好きな人に抱かれたい. So 抱かれる is to be embraced by, or it's also a euphemism for to be made love to. 好きな人に. So 好きな人 is your subject here. 好きな人 is your crush, the one you love, the one you like. に. So I want to be held by or made love to by the one I love or my crush. So I want my crush to make love to me, basically, is kind of what that means in active voice. For timestamps to the sentences I covered in this video, check the pinned comment in the top of the comment section or the video description. Also in the video description, you will find links to other places to learn Japanese, because I hope that I'm not the only place you're learning Japanese from. There's also a link for my Watch Sailor Stars Learn Japanese series in there, so have fun, go crazy. Thank you to all the patrons who make this and other series possible on this channel. If you want to, for as little as $1 or $2 a month, you can support this series and also receive some bonus study materials. I've got song translation breakdowns that you can even vote on. I've got Sailor Moon song translation breakdowns, and I have like study guides and worksheets and answer keys that go with these series, so check it out, go crazy, have fun. And be sure to tune in next week when we cover the te aru verb ending. 頑張ってね!